What if the foundation of the world's most famous skyline was built on a catastrophic lie? Beneath every gleaming tower, every crowded subway, every street New Yorkers cross without a second thought, there are pressurized iron tombs, hollow pockets, and blasted bedrock that the city's engineers knew were unstable. They built anyway, and those decisions are still down there. Manhattan looks like permanence. The skyline rising off the Hudson, the grid of streets worn smooth by a century of footsteps, the bridges anchored like they grew from the riverbed, all of it projects an image of engineered certainty. But the island was always the wrong place to build this. Narrow, surrounded by tidal water, sitting on bedrock that fractures unpredictably and clay that swallows weight. The engineers who first drove foundations into this ground knew exactly what they were dealing with. They left records. They filed reports. And then the city built over those records and kept building upward. What most New Yorkers have never been told is that the infrastructure holding Manhattan above water was not a triumph of engineering. It was a series of calculated gambles, each one buried before the next began. Not metaphorically buried. Physically. Sealed beneath the streets, beneath the river, beneath the weight of everything constructed on top of them and never meant to be found. The men who made those decisions are long gone. The decisions themselves are not. This is where those gambles live. Below the street. Below the tunnels. Down in the pressurized dark. The men who worked the caissons did not die quickly. That is the part that gets left out of the history. They surfaced after their shifts, walked through the airlock, climbed back into daylight, and then, hours later, something went wrong inside them. It started in the joints. A deep, grinding pain that moved, hips, knees, shoulders, spine, that locked the body into positions it could not escape. Men were found bent double, unable to straighten, unable to explain what was happening because no one had language for it yet. Some lost feeling in their legs entirely. Some lost the use of their arms. A few did not wake up the following morning. The workers called it the Grecian sickness. The engineers called it, when they had to call it anything, an inconvenience of the work. What was actually happening was this. At the pressures inside the caissons, nitrogen from the compressed air dissolved directly into the bloodstream. When workers ascended too quickly, that nitrogen came back out of solution as bubbles, forming inside joints, inside muscle tissue, inside the spinal cord. The bubbles did not dissipate. They expanded. They blocked circulation. They destroyed tissue from the inside, in the dark, hours after the man had already left the worksite and gone home. 3 workers died directly as a result of caisson disease during the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. Dozens more were permanently disabled. Joints that never unlocked, limbs that never regained full function, men in their 30s and 40s who moved for the rest of their lives like something had broken inside them that no one could see or fix. Washington Roebling himself was among them. By 1872, he could no longer descend. By 1873, he could barely leave his bed. The paralysis that took hold of him in the caissons never fully released him. John Myers went down in the spring of 1872 and came back up the same way he always had, through the airlock, into the air, onto the riverbank. By that evening, he could not stand. Within 4 days, he could not move his legs. He was dead before the week was out. He was not the first. He was not the last. He was simply the one whose name appears in the engineering records, logged in a field report by a site supervisor who noted the death, noted the symptoms, and filed the paper with the rest of the construction documentation. Those records exist. They have always existed. And here is what else exists in the Roebling family's own archived correspondence from that same period. A clear, documented understanding that slowing the decompression schedule, bringing workers up more gradually, allowing the nitrogen time to leave the blood safely, would have prevented the deaths. It would also have added a year to the construction timeline and nearly $1 million to the budget. The decision was made. The schedule did not change. The men kept ascending too fast, and the city kept its bridge on time. To understand what was buried, you have to go back to the problem that started it all. Manhattan does not sit on solid ground. It sits on an island edged by tidal rivers, and to build anything that would last, a bridge, a tower, a tunnel, you had to reach bedrock. In the middle of the 19th century, the only way to do that beneath a river was to build a room and sink it. They called them caissons. Massive iron and timber chambers, open at the bottom, pressurized from above, driven down through riverbed mud and silt until they contacted stone. Workers entered through airlock shafts, descended into the pressurized darkness, and excavated by hand, shoveling the riverbed out from beneath the chamber so it sank under its own weight, inch by inch, foot by foot, toward bedrock 78 feet below the surface of the East River. Inside, nothing behaved the way it should. The air pressure, twice what exists at the surface, did things to the physical world that the workers had no framework to explain. Candle flames burned flat and blue instead of upright. Voices dropped in pitch, thickened, arrived strangely in the ear. Tools felt different in the hand. Men reported a persistent ringing, a heaviness in the joints, a sense that the body itself was being compressed from every direction simultaneously, because it was. Washington Roebling, the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge, descended into the caissons himself, repeatedly, because he believed no engineer should ask workers to endure conditions he had not personally assessed. He was meticulous, exacting, and entirely unprepared for what sustained exposure to that pressure would do to a human body. He never fully recovered. By the time the bridge's towers were rising above the river, Roebling was directing construction from a bedroom window in Brooklyn Heights, too damaged to walk the site he had designed. The Brooklyn Bridge required 2 caissons, one for the Brooklyn Tower, one for the Manhattan side. Each one was roughly the size of a city block. Each one was driven to depth, filled with concrete once the tower foundation was set, sealed, and left. Not removed. Not demolished. Left. They are there today, intact, entombed beneath the East River at the base of one of the most photographed structures in the world. No one has surveyed them since 1883. No one has opened them. The river has risen 8 inches around them since the day they were sealed, and the city has never formally assessed what that means for the riverbed above. Most people who walk across the Brooklyn Bridge are looking up. At the cables, the stone towers, the span of the thing, the skyline beyond it. What they are standing above, what every tourist photograph frames without knowing it, are 2 pressurized iron rooms the size of city blocks, sealed for 140 years, sitting in the dark beneath the water. The New York Bridge Company had a public explanation ready. It was not the pressure. It was not the nitrogen. It was not the schedule they had chosen and refused to alter. It was the men. Their constitutions were weak. They had overexerted themselves. The work was demanding, and some workers were simply not suited to its demands. This was the official position, stated in company communications, repeated to the press, entered into the public record as the explanation for why men who had descended into the caissons healthy were ascending from them paralyzed or dead. Inside the company's own files, the explanation was different. Engineering memos dated to 1872, internal documents, never published, not intended for outside review, described the relationship between rapid decompression and the physical collapse of workers with a clinical precision that made the public statements impossible to read as ignorance. The men writing those memos knew what was happening. They understood the mechanism. They had enough information to change the schedule, to bring workers up slowly enough that the nitrogen could leave the bloodstream without destroying it. They chose not to. The financial reality was this. By mid-1872, the Brooklyn Bridge was already $2 million over its projected budget. The project was under political pressure from every direction. The city, the state, the private investors who had backed it. Slowing the decompression process to a safe rate would have extended caisson work by another year and added approximately $800,000 to a budget that was already being scrutinized in the New York papers. 3 weeks after John Myers died, the board of the New York Bridge Company met and voted to continue existing decompression schedules without modification. The meeting lasted less than 2 hours. The vote was not close. What followed was the construction of one of the most celebrated engineering achievements in American history. The towers rose. The cables were spun. The span was completed in 1883 and opened to a crowd of hundreds of thousands, and the President of the United States walked across it, and the newspapers called it the eighth wonder of the world. None of the coverage mentioned the sealed chambers beneath the river. None of it mentioned the memos. None of it mentioned John Myers, or the men who moved differently for the rest of their lives, or the vote that had been taken 3 weeks after the last death and had determined that the schedule would not change. The Brooklyn Bridge's anchorages, the massive stone structures on either shore that hold the cables under tension, sit directly above the sealed caissons. They have always sat above them. Every photograph ever taken of the bridge, every painting, every postcard sold in every tourist shop in Lower Manhattan frames those anchorages in the shot. The cover-up is in every image. It has been visible for 140 years. No one points at it. The caissons were not the only gamble. They were the one that killed men quickly enough to leave a record. The larger gamble was geological, and it was made not once but dozens of times, across decades, by engineers who understood exactly what the ground beneath Manhattan was doing and built upward anyway. Manhattan's bedrock is not the solid, continuous foundation that the skyline implies. It is fractured, uneven, and in several critical locations, dramatically deep. Beneath Midtown and Lower Manhattan runs a geological feature that survives in engineering literature under the understated name of the Manhattan Valley, a trough in the bedrock where the surface drops away sharply, replaced by layers of soft mica schist, clay, and glacial till that compress under weight rather than bearing it. In a city built on the premise of going higher, the ground beneath the most valuable real estate on Earth does not behave like ground is supposed to behave. The correct engineering response to this was known at the time. Foundations should reach bedrock. Caissons should be driven to consistent depth, anchored to stone, not stopped at whatever depth the budget allowed. This is what the geology required. It is not what was built. When the Flatiron Building went up in 1902 on the corner of 5th Avenue and 23rd Street, 22 stories, one of the tallest buildings in the city at the time, its foundations did not reach bedrock. The schist was too far down. Reaching it would have cost more than the budget permitted and taken longer than the schedule allowed, and so the Flatiron sits on compressed soil footings, bearing its weight on compacted fill rather than stone. It was not the only building founded this way. Along Broadway, several of the early towers that define the Manhattan skyline rest on the same compromise, foundations that stop where the money ran out, not where the geology became reliable. The same trough runs beneath the 4, 5, and 6 subway lines. The tunnels that carry more than 1 million passengers a day along the Lexington Avenue corridor were bored through mica schist that has no continuous contact with stable bedrock. Tunnels moving through material that shifts with groundwater, that compresses under sustained load, that does not hold its position the way stone holds its position. The engineers who built them knew this. The riders who use them do not. The failure scenario is not dramatic in the way that collapses are dramatic. It does not happen all at once. What geologists and structural engineers call differential settlement is a slow, asymmetric process, one side of a foundation sinking at a different rate than the other, the building frame absorbing the difference, steel and concrete torquing under stresses they were not designed to carry. At a certain point, the frame stops absorbing and starts failing. The building does not fall. It twists. And the ground beneath it, the soft schist and clay and compressed fill, keeps moving. In October of 1915, a crew boring the IRT extension beneath Lexington Avenue struck something that was not on any map. At 90 feet below street level, in a section of tunnel between what would become the 51st and 59th Street stations, the drill face hit water. Not seepage. Not the ordinary groundwater that tunnel workers managed as a matter of routine. A pressurized underground stream, unmapped and unsuspected, moving through the mica schist at volume, and when the boring broke through into it, the tunnel face began to move. Harold Vail was the engineer on site that night. His field report, filed the following morning and retained in the IRT Construction Archive, describes what he found when he reached the section. The tunnel lining was flexing inward under hydrostatic pressure from behind. He used the phrase, "the wall breathing." The timber supports were taking load they had not been designed to carry, the cast iron lining segments were separating at the joints, and the material behind the lining, the schist, the stream, the 90 feet of Manhattan above it, was pushing. For workers who had been in the affected section when the pressure event began could not be reached through the primary tunnel. They were extracted over the following 18 hours through an emergency bore driven through a parallel section, brought out through a hole barely wide enough to pass a man, into a tunnel that was itself at risk. The emergency shoring operation ran for 72 hours without stopping. Timber was driven in from both ends of the affected section. The water flow was partially diverted through emergency drainage channels cut into the tunnel floor, and the decision was made to rebuild 40 feet of tunnel lining from scratch rather than attempt to reinforce what was already failing. The rebuild took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, the section was sealed, the workers were reassigned without public explanation, and the construction timeline for that portion of the line was quietly extended. The city's official report on the delay attributed it to geological survey revision, a phrase that appears in the document without elaboration, without any reference to the pressure event, without any mention of the 4 workers who had been trapped or the tunnel lining that had partially collapsed inward and been rebuilt in secret. The New York Tribune ran a brief item describing a minor construction delay due to unexpected groundwater. 14 words. No names. No detail. The item appeared once and was not followed up. What had actually occurred was this. 90 feet beneath one of the busiest street corridors in Manhattan, 40 feet of tunnel had come close enough to catastrophic failure that the engineer on site used the word breathing to describe what he was watching the walls do. The city sealed the record, rebuilt the section, and ran trains through it for the next 100 years. If you have ever taken the 4, 5, or 6 train through Midtown, you have passed through that section. You pass through it without knowing. Everyone does. The Brooklyn Bridge caissons have not been opened since 1883. No survey has been conducted on their interior condition. No assessment has been made of how the cast iron and timber that line them have responded to 140 years of submersion, pressure, and the slow infiltration of East River water into whatever gaps have formed in the seal. They sit beneath active shipping traffic, beneath the footings of one of the most visited landmarks in the world, and the last person to document their internal condition was a 19th-century engineer whose instruments could not have detected what a modern structural survey would look for. What is inside them now? Whether the concrete fill has held, whether the timber has degraded, whether the chambers remain intact or have begun to compromise the riverbed above them, is not known. It has not been investigated. The city has not looked. Beneath Lower Manhattan, the caissons are not confined to the bridge. The skyscraper construction boom of the 1880s through 1900s drove pneumatic chambers into the ground across the lower end of the island, each one sunk to whatever depth the project required and sealed when the foundation was complete. At least 11 of these chambers have been identified in historical construction records. Their precise locations have not all been confirmed. Several of the firms that built them dissolved in the early 20th century, and the detailed site records dissolved with them, absorbed into other companies, lost in office closures, simply gone. 11 known chambers, locations partially unmapped, sitting beneath streets that have been rebuilt several times over since the chambers were sealed, in a neighborhood that now contains some of the densest commercial real estate on Earth. In 2019, the MTA conducted an infrastructure audit of the Lexington Avenue line. The audit flagged a 400-meter section of the 4 and 5 train corridor beneath Park Avenue as containing undocumented void space adjacent to the tunnel lining. The audit report used that phrase, undocumented void space, and did not elaborate on its origin, its size, its composition, or what relationship it might have to the construction history of the corridor. The report noted the flag and moved on. Directly above that 400-meter section, Grand Central Terminal, the MetLife building, and a stretch of Park Avenue that on any given weekday carries more foot traffic than most American cities contain. For the sealed caissons beneath the East River to become a surface-level problem, the sequence is specific. Sustained groundwater infiltration into the sealed chambers over time. Degradation of the seal and the fill material inside. Compromise of the riverbed directly above the chamber roofs as the structural integrity of what sits beneath it changes. The East River has risen 8 inches since the caissons were sealed in 1883. The water that surrounds them is higher than it has ever been in the history of those structures. The infiltration is not hypothetical. It is the direction that water moves, given time and pressure, which are the two things the caissons have had in abundance. 3 separate institutional reports, produced by 3 separate agencies over 3 years, have each arrived at the same place. The 2019 MTA Infrastructure Audit. The 2021 New York City Department of Buildings Foundation Survey for the Manhattan Core. The Army Corps of Engineers 2022 Coastal Resilience Assessment. All 3 reference legacy subterranean voids beneath the city. All 3 acknowledge that these voids exist, that their origins are partially documented, that their current condition is not fully known. None of the 3 propose remediation. None of them outline a plan to locate, assess, or address what is sitting beneath the streets. They note the problem. They file the note. They move on to the next item. What the city has built instead is a monitoring system. Sensor arrays installed on high-risk blocks track ground settlement in real time, measuring millimeter-level movement in the surface above the flagged corridors. The sensors feed into alert thresholds. When movement exceeds those thresholds, evacuation protocols are triggered. This is the current approach, not stabilization, not remediation, not a program to understand and address what is underground. A system that watches for the moment when what is underground becomes visible at the surface and responds to that moment after it has already begun. The city is not fixing the problem. It is waiting to be notified when the problem announces itself. Above the primary risk corridor, the population density makes the monitoring system's limitations worth considering carefully. On any given weekday, 280,000 commuters pass through Grand Central Terminal. 1.2 million people use the 4, 5, and 6 trains daily. The line that runs through the flagged 400-meter section beneath Park Avenue, the line that bores through the mica schist trough, the line whose 1915 near collapse was rebuilt in secret and whose undocumented void space was noted in an audit report and not followed up. 1.2 million people moving through the same corridor every day. In 2018, a Columbia University engineering study modeled the infrastructure impact of a major subsurface failure event in the Midtown corridor. The estimate was $47 billion in infrastructure damage. 200,000 residents displaced. Those figures do not include the economic cost of closing the Lexington Avenue line, or the cascading failures in a transit system where the 4, 5, and 6 carry a disproportionate share of the city's daily movement. The study was published in an academic journal. It was not covered by the New York papers. It did not prompt a response from the MTA or the Department of Buildings. It entered the record and stayed there. If you ride the 4, 5, or 6 train to work, you pass through the flagged section in the morning and again in the evening. You have been passing through it every working day. The sensors are running. The thresholds are set. The city is watching. It is simply watching from above. In 1872, the New York Bridge Company made a calculation. The schedule mattered more than the men who built it, and the ground beneath was stable enough. That calculation has never been revisited. No one has gone back down into the caissons. No one has mapped the 11 abandoned chambers beneath Lower Manhattan. No one has opened the 2019 audit flag into a remediation program or commissioned the survey that would tell the city what is actually sitting in that 400-meter void beneath Park Avenue. The caissons are still sealed. The voids are still unmapped. The mica schist beneath Midtown still shifts with the water table, and the city's answer is a sensor array that tells you when it's already too late. Above all of it, the tourists with their phones raised toward the bridge cables, the commuters moving through Grand Central without looking down, the office towers rising in glass and steel, and the absolute confidence of things built to last, the city continues. the skyline that the world photographs as proof of what human ambition can achieve. None of them know what's underneath.